Have you ever imagined what happens when a tank battalion advances 50 kilometers in a day, only to stop cold, not from enemy fire, but from empty fuel tanks? That's not a hypothetical. That was the Eastern Front, winter of 1941. Not all victories are forged in fire. Some are built in silence, along frozen tracks, in ration lines, on the shoulders of exhausted men hauling crates of ammunition through knee-deep snow. What if I told you that the real front line of World War II wasn't drawn by bullets, but by railroads? Welcome to the side of war that rarely makes the history books, where every shell fired required a dozen unseen hands, where food mattered more than fear, and where losing a single convoy meant watching an entire division crumble. The Soviet army didn't just survive the Eastern Front, it outlasted the deadliest machine the world had ever seen, the Wehrmacht. And it did so with an invisible weapon: logistics. Let's begin where war doesn't usually start, in the quiet of the supply lines. It was a common myth, still believed today, that strategy begins at the front, where bullets fly and orders shout through smoke. But for the Red Army, strategy began at the rail line hundreds of kilometers behind the clash. A soldier named Yuri Petrov, who fought outside Smolensk, recalled in his journal, "They told us we had the tanks, the men, the will, but when the train never came, we knew what that meant. We'd already lost." This is what we call the invisible error, the fatal oversight of ignoring the lifeblood of war. It's not flashy, it's not glorious, but it decides everything. Now imagine this. The temperature has dropped to negative 30 degrees Celsius. Trains are stalled, fuel drums are frozen solid. You're in a Soviet trench near Vyazma, and your unit hasn't eaten in 36 hours. You don't care about ideology, you don't care about Stalin or Hitler, you care about calories, warmth, and whether the next resupply will reach you before the next attack does. This wasn't rare, this was the war. And here lies the brutal truth. Once noted by historian Richard Overy, industrial war is logistical war. The Red Army's very survival depended not on daring charges, but whether the next shipment of diesel and potatoes survived the snowbound trek through bombed-out railways. The so-called rail war was fought not just with sabotage and steel, but with patience, desperation, and an understanding that a maneuver without maintenance is suicide in slow motion. The Red Army learned this the hard way. Fast advances? Useless. If the fuel trucks can't keep up, push too fast and you strand your own strength. It's like chasing victory on foot while your lifeline limps behind unbroken rails. One forgotten winter night near the outskirts of Tula, a single lost convoy, misrouted due to an air raid, left the 312th Rifle Division without ammunition for 18 hours. By morning, over 600 men were dead, not from enemy fire, but from silence. Lose one convoy, lose an entire division. This was the rhythm of the Eastern Front, not the booming tempo of artillery, but the anxious ticking of rail schedules, the creaking of frost-covered wagons, the low hum of desperation beneath every movement. And yet, this invisible war would shape the most visible victories. Now, let's rewind to the beginning, to when the gears of destruction were first set in motion, and Stalin's own pride became the first blockade to Soviet survival. You wake up before dawn. It's June 22, 1941. The light is faint, barely seeping through the gaps in your barracks window. Somewhere off in the distance, you think you hear thunder. But it's not thunder, it's the beginning of something else. You're a Soviet logistics officer stationed outside Brest, and in the next 60 seconds, your entire world will burn. 3 million German soldiers just crossed the border. And you weren't ready. None of you were. Here's the hard truth no one likes to admit. The Red Army didn't stumble because it lacked men or weapons. It stumbled because it had built a war machine that couldn't move when it needed to. And that failure started long before the first tank rolled east. Let's rewind. Stalin didn't believe Hitler would invade. Not yet. Not while Britain was still resisting in the West. Intelligence reports warned him. Dozens of them. Even Richard Sorge, embedded deep in Tokyo, sent crystal-clear warnings Germany would strike soon. But Stalin, stubborn and deeply suspicious of everyone, dismissed it all. He thought it was a British trick to pull the USSR into the war too early. So, nothing was mobilized, no shift in rail schedules, no movement of supply depots. Thousands of trains were still running peacetime patterns. Ammunition was stored near the western frontier, right where the first bombs would fall. What happened next wasn't just a surprise attack. It was a logistical ambush. Within hours, German bombers obliterated Soviet airfields, railway junctions, and communication lines. Entire supply depots vanished under fire. And while the Wehrmacht advanced with terrifying speed, the Red Army's vast stores of fuel and ammunition sat, unused, unreachable, and now burning. Imagine you're Lieutenant Grigory Mirov, in charge of a fuel convoy outside Grodno. You've got orders to supply the 3rd Mechanized Corps, on paper, one of the largest armored groups in the world. But the roads are jammed with civilians fleeing east, rail lines have been cratered, and every map you were issued, useless. Most routes marked secure are now German-controlled. By nightfall, Mirov abandons his trucks, not because he's a coward, but because there's no path forward. The tanks will run dry, and the men inside them, they'll be left to fight with what they can carry. We often think of Operation Barbarossa as a clash of steel and will, but that's not how it started. It started with paralysis, not from fear, but from miscalculation. Soviet forces had mass, that's true, thousands of tanks, hundreds of thousands of men, but they didn't have momentum. They didn't have the ability to move, to resupply, to breathe. The result was divisions that looked terrifying on paper were dying in place, immobile, starving, disconnected. And then came the terrain. Western Russia wasn't friendly ground. Roads were narrow, often unpaved. Bridges collapsed under retreating weight. Every kilometer became a gamble. The Wehrmacht knew this. Their initial strike didn't just aim for military bases, it aimed at lifelines, railways, fuel depots, communication hubs. They weren't just trying to fight the Red Army, they were trying to starve it. One Soviet general put it plainly. We had the bodies, the bones were already broken. And you could feel that fracture on the ground. Outside of Minsk, a hospital collapsed under the weight of its own wounded, not from lack of care, but because supply trucks carrying morphine and clean bandages were destroyed the night before. The wounded lay in silence, not a battlefield silence, the kind of silence when you know help isn't coming. By early July, Stalin ordered counterattacks, but how do you counterattack with no fuel, no ammo, no maps? Divisions sent west to plug the gaps found themselves surrounded before they could even deploy. The Germans weren't just faster, they were unopposed by logistics. And the Soviet response? Fire. Not the fire of resistance, but the fire of denial. If we couldn't use it, we'd burn it. Grain silos, rail yards, fuel tanks, torched. To slow the German advance? Yes, but also to punish ourselves for believing we were ready. This was the first blow of Barbarossa, not a military defeat, but a revelation that the Red Army's greatest enemy wasn't just a Wehrmacht, it was its own refusal to prepare. So here we are, tens of thousands dead, entire fronts collapsing. Stalin, the Kremlin, silent, stunned, and in the smoldering remains of a logistics hub outside Orzha, a young mechanic named Ilyin writes a note in his notebook. We had tanks, but no oil. We had maps, but no orders. I think we died before we fought. But the fire wouldn't be the end. It would become a new beginning. A weapon in its own right. Because when the Soviet Union had nothing left to hold, it started to destroy. Not just the enemy, everything. Should we keep going? In the next chapter, we'll see how the Red Army turned its own soil into a scorched trap. Imagine marching eastward through the ruins of a town you didn't even fight for. No gunfire, no enemy resistance, just blackened husks of homes, bridges collapsed into ash, and rail lines twisted like broken ribs. You're a German soldier in late July 1941, and what you're seeing isn't retreat, it's vengeance. It's the Soviet Union burning itself to starve you. After the shock of Barbarossa, Stalin faced a choice no leader should ever have to make: save the land or save the war. He chose the war. With entire fronts collapsing and German columns blitzing through Belarusia and into Ukraine, the Soviet command turned to an ancient tactic: scorched earth. Leave nothing, not a field of grain, not a single working rail car. This wasn't a new concept. Even in classical times, the Scythians, nomadic horsemen of the steppes, lured invaders deep into the plains, torching everything behind them. But what Stalin unleashed was scorched earth on an industrial scale. Orders went out directly from Stavka, the Soviet high command: destroy bridges, dynamite depots, poison wells. Civilians were given minutes, sometimes seconds, to evacuate. Then came the flames. In the city of Smolensk, Soviet engineers rigged entire warehouses with explosives. The air smelled of kerosene and rot. Supplies that could have fed an army for weeks, obliterated in seconds. It was a calculated retreat, not of soldiers, but of logistics. Antony Beevor, a historian of brutal clarity, once wrote that war, when stripped of its pretense, is brutality in numbers. And in 1941, those numbers were millions. Millions trapped between two colliding giants, cut off from supply, abandoned not just by policy, but by necessity. The Soviet strategy was simple in its cruelty. If we can't have it, no one will. That included grain, oil, livestock, rail hubs. Entire villages were turned into fire traps, and sometimes they burned while still occupied. It wasn't just destruction, it was logistics by subtraction. A colonel named Ivan Rudenko wrote in his diary while evacuating Vinnytsia, "We had 1 hour, burn the wheat, destroy the mills, tear up the iron from the rails, and if the villagers resist, leave them. The war will not wait for hearts." The Red Army didn't carry this out in malice, but out of desperation. Every factory torched bought time. Every rail cut slowed the Wehrmacht. But time was a cruel ally. It helped the Soviets survive, but it crushed the innocent. In some towns, the flames came before the Germans. In others, they came after. Outside Kiev, local peasants begged NKVD units not to torch the silos. Children clung to bags of flour, and yet the fire came.
It's easy to speak of this as strategy, but let's be honest, it was also trauma. Deep, unforgettable. For the soldiers retreating through those fields, the smell of burnt grain stayed with them longer than any gunshot. For civilians, it was worse. Entire families left behind, not because they were forgotten, but because they were calculated into the loss. This is the haunting cost of war when geography becomes a weapon. And yet, destruction brought something unexpected. It gave the Soviets leverage. Every depot destroyed made the Germans go farther for supplies. Every field razed stretched their lines thinner. What looked like loss became, paradoxically, a form of resistance. The Red Army turned absence into advantage. Strategically, it worked. By the time Army Group Center reached Smolensk, its supply chain was a skeleton. Trains couldn't keep up. Roads became graveyards for fuel trucks. And suddenly, the blitzkrieg that had devoured Poland and France began to stall. Not from Soviet firepower, but from empty fuel tanks. Even the weather seemed to conspire. Some rains turned dirt roads into viscous mud. German divisions bogged down in towns they thought would fall in hours, and behind them Soviet sappers doubled back to torch what they'd missed. One story, part confirmed, part whispered legend, tells of a Soviet woman named Zodia Filimonova, a rail worker outside Bryansk. When the order came to evacuate, she stayed behind. She loaded the final train with refugees, and then made the depot herself, killing dozens of German troops as they arrived. Her name never made it to the front page, but among the locals they whispered, "Zonia Fedes," then she denied them. Was it heroism, madness, or both? That's the brutality of this chapter. Morality and tactics blurred. Destruction became currency. The Soviet Union was not just fighting with bullets. It was fighting with absence, with the ghost of what once stood. By autumn, entire sectors of the driven front were held together by shoestrings to ply. For every mile gained, there was a cost. In fuel, in food, in blood. The Soviets had lost land that they had planted fire in its soil. And this scorched earth, it wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a deeper adaptation. One that would reshape the Soviet ragging machine from its ruins.
There are moments in war when the smoke begins to clear. Not on the battlefield, but behind it, when desperation hardens into calculation, and the very structure of survival is rebuilt from scratch. For the Soviet Union, that moment arrived in 1942. By then, the Red Army had bled across hundreds of kilometers. The front had shifted, but not decisively. The Germans were still pressing, and the Soviets were still staggering. But behind the chaos, something quieter was happening, something that would change the course of the war. They were rebuilding the rails. The Soviet High Command had realized a simple truth, brutal but undeniable. You can't win a war if you can't move, and you can't move without railroads. That winter, under snow thick enough to hide whole convoys, General Georgy Zhukov emerged not just as a tactician, but as a logistics visionary. His doctrine was clear. Don't move troops, move the rail. He wasn't being poetic. He was being practical. What good is a division if its fuel is 3 days behind it? What use is a counterattack if the artillery shells are still somewhere in Siberia? So they started over, and they started in the east. Beyond the reach of German bombers, deep behind the Ural Mountains, Soviet industry reawakened. Entire factories, steel mills, locomotive plants, munitions depots had been dismantled and relocated there during the Panic of 1941. Now, in 1942, they weren't just operating, they were expanding. Centralization was the word of the hour. Logistics wasn't scattered anymore. It was fused. Military-industrial complexes were linked with hardened lines, guarded routes, and a growing coordination apparatus that ran like a second general staff. One report from the Sverdlovsk region noted that in just 3 months, production had doubled. Not because of machines, but because there was finally a system to move what they made. But not all of it came from metal and coal. Much of it came from blood. The Soviet Union didn't have the luxury of free labor, so they turned brutally to the Gulag. Thousands, tens of thousands of prisoners were conscripted into rail construction battalions. No rifles, no winter gear, just pickaxes, frostbitten hands, and a deadline that could kill. One such battalion worked the Perm-Kotlas rail corridor, laying tracks through snow deeper than a man is tall. Among them was a former professor named Yevgeny Antonov, arrested in 1938, sentenced for counter-revolutionary writing. Now in 1942, he was laying steel with a broken rib. He wrote on scraps of paper, smuggled in his boots, "We are no longer prisoners, we are veins. If we stop flowing, the front dies." History rarely remembers men like Antonov, but their tracks carried the weight of armies. By summer, a new rhythm had settled across Soviet territory. Rail cars moved day and night, not just east to west, but dynamically, flexibly. New junctions were constructed to avoid bombed-out zones. Decoy lines were deployed to mislead Luftwaffe scouts. And, most critically, the Red Army began thinking backwards. They no longer asked, "Where should we attack?" They asked, "Where can we supply?" That shift changed everything. Take the push toward Rzhev in August 1942. The Soviets could have struck at Kalinin or Bryansk, but they chose Rzhev not for symbolic value, but because the restructured rail grid could support a sustained offensive there. It wasn't about glory, it was about fuel, and that knowledge seeped into the ranks. Soldiers noticed the difference. For the first time, they received winter uniforms before the frost. Bread rations came regularly. Artillery wasn't silent due to lack of shells. A corporal named Pavel Kolesnik, fighting in the 33rd Army near Vyazma, wrote home, "We have boots." Can you believe that? Real ones, not wrapped cloth. And the guns haven't stopped. We feel like someone remembered we're here. That's not just morale. That's psychological logistics. A soldier doesn't fight harder because he's told to. He fights harder when he knows someone, somewhere, is sending help. That's when you start to win. The reform wasn't perfect. Corruption lingered, mistakes were made, but the shift was undeniable. The Red Army, once spread thin and crumbling, was now being pulled together, rail by rail, tie by tie. And in the silence of those rebuild stations, a revolution was happening. Not with fanfare, not with slogans, but with cold steel and hotter resolve. The Soviets had stopped trying to win the war at the front. They were now winning it behind the lines. And in doing so, they had laid the tracks not just for survival, but for victory. But victory wouldn't come cheap. Ahead lay the trap. The city of Stalingrad was the question. Wasn't who would take it, but who could feed it long enough to endure.
Stalingrad wasn't just a city. It was a fulcrum, a hinge upon which the weight of two empires balanced until one snapped. By the autumn of 1942, the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus had pushed deep into Soviet territory. Their objective was symbolic and strategic. Take Stalingrad, sever the Volga, and choke Soviet logistics between the Caucasus oil fields and the industrial north. It was Hitler's vision of a final blow. But vision without numbers means nothing in war. At first glance, it looked inevitable. The Wehrmacht surged through the southern steppe, swallowing villages, shattering resistance. Paulus believed the city would fall in weeks, but what he didn't account for was silence. Not in the sense of peace, but in supply. Before a single Soviet soldier fired from the ruins of the tractor factory, the German Sixth Army was already starving. Their lifeline stretched 600 kilometers back to the Dnieper. Every shell, every ration, every liter of fuel had to cross dust-choked roads or bomb-riddled tracks. And once the frost came, those roads turned to glass. Trucks skidded, horses froze, engines seized. Inside Stalingrad, the Germans still advanced, but they did so hungry. And then the trap snapped shut. Soviet General Georgy Zhuzhakov, alongside Alexander Vasilevsky, launched Operation Uranus on November 19, 1942. It wasn't a head-on clash. It was a curve, a pincer designed not to break the front, but to strangle it. The Soviet strategy didn't aim for the center of the Sixth Army. It aimed for its edges, where the flanks were held by Romanian and Italian forces, under-equipped and overexposed. And here lies the genius. The trap was logistical. Those flanks weren't just weak, they were underfed, underarmed, barely connected to Paulus's corps. Soviet armor poured through them like water through cloth. In 4 days, the German Sixth Army was surrounded. But this wasn't just encirclement, it was isolation. Now ask yourself, what does an army need to survive a siege in winter? Food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies. And how do you get those into a surrounded cauldron when the only option is by air? You don't. Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, boasted that his planes could deliver 500 tons of supplies daily. That was the number needed just to maintain minimal fighting capacity. But over the next weeks, they never averaged more than 80, even on clear days. Even when it mattered most. The numbers didn't lie. Arithmetic was the real enemy, and it was merciless. As Soviet artillery closed in, the Germans dug in, into frozen basements, into factories shattered by mortars. Soldiers were issued horse meat, then sawdust bread, then nothing. Frostbite set in, ammunition was rationed to single digits. Inside that steel ring, something deeper than hunger spread. Moral exhaustion. A private named Wilhelm Richter, holed up near the city center, wrote in a final letter, "We do not see day or night anymore, only gray. We do not fight the Russians. We fight the silence. And I think we are losing." Meanwhile, the Soviets weren't just waiting. They were moving. Night after night, new supply railheads were established, some laid in frozen mud, others rebuilt on the fly under sniper fire. Unlike the trapped Germans, Soviet soldiers knew behind them the machine still worked. It wasn't just weapons that arrived. It was warmth. It was boots. It was the feeling that you weren't alone. And that made all the difference. Zhuzhakov's plan worked not just because of tanks, but because every tank had fuel, every battery had shells, every platoon had rations. Behind each line of fire was a second line, one of engineers, track layers, medics, quartermasters. This was not just strategy, it was a logistical symphony. That January 1943, Paulus's men were eating their own horses, then the stray dogs, then silence again. The final collapse came not with a bang, but with stillness.
On January 31, 1943, General Paulus surrendered. Not in a blaze of glory, in a cellar, under a broken city, without food, without hope. He hadn't even been informed he had been promoted to field marshal days before. A promotion intended to shame him into suicide. But he didn't. He surrendered. Because there was nothing left to fight with. Stalingrad wasn't won in the city. It was won in the rear. In the rail lines that shifted overnight. In the convoys that moved beneath frozen scars. In the hands of nameless men who packed crates and laid track, who never fired a bullet, but fed the victory. In war, we often looked for heroes at the front, but here, the hero was silent and steel. And now, the war wasn't just turning, it was bleeding forward. Ahead lay Rzhev. And there, the Red Army would face something different. Not a trap, a grinder.
By early 1942, west of Moscow, there existed a place that maps marked with coordinates, but veterans remembered only with dread. Rzhev. To outsiders, it looked like a dot on the map. To soldiers, it was a grinder of flesh and steel. The Red Army called it the Death Trap. The Germans called it the Rzhev Salient. But names don't capture it. Only silence does. The kind of silence that follows when a place stops being a city and becomes a wound. After the Soviet counteroffensive had pushed the Wehrmacht back from the gates of Moscow in late 1941, the front line twisted into a jagged shape, a dagger pointing toward the Soviet capital, held stubbornly by German Army Group Center, and right at the heart of it sat Rzhev, just 200 kilometers from Moscow. The Red Army needed it, politically, strategically, emotionally. But to take it meant facing more than the enemy. It meant fighting the mud, it meant fighting hunger, it meant fighting distance. From January 1942 to March 1943, Soviet forces launched multiple offensives to reclaim Rzhev, each more costly than the last. This was not a single battle, but a series of assaults, in each clashing against the same brutal realization. Maneuver without maintenance was suicide. Why did the Soviets keep trying? Because every kilometer lost at Rzhev was a dagger pressing closer to Moscow's throat. Because Stalin could not afford another symbol of paralysis. And because the new Soviet logistical apparatus, reborn in the East, still struggled to deliver its promise to the front. The terrain was merciless. Snow in winter, swamp in thaw, mud so thick it could suck the boots off a man's feet, and it often did. Supply roads weren't roads, they were rivers of dirt. Rail lines existed only in theory, and so the burden of logistics fell on the soldiers themselves. Entire battalions became beasts of burden. Ammunition was hauled by hand, shells carried on shoulders, field kitchens dragged on sleighs by exhausted men. One rifleman, Mikhail Gorgdikov of the 33rd Rifle Division, wrote in a letter never sent, "We marched 4 days with nothing warm. They say we'll have support tomorrow. Tomorrow was 3 weeks ago. The dead are easier to carry than the crates." This wasn't hyperbole. This was the strategy. The front at Rzhev was so fluid, so fragile, that Soviet supply columns collapsed as quickly as they formed. German artillery zeroed in on every makeshift depot. Machine gun nests shredded every incoming truck. In response, Soviet commanders turned to a bitter rhythm: sacrifice. Supply units were sent forward under cover of night, knowing most wouldn't return. Horses froze, drivers died at the wheel. But even one cart of ammunition reaching the front could mean
a trench held for another hour. And those hours bled into months. The Zhev salient became a paradox. Static, yet deadly. Troops dug into positions they'd never hold for long. German forces fortified hilltops, bunkers, reinforced with scavenged metal. Soviet troops attacked again and again, not for conquest, but to wear the enemy thin. Attrition wasn't the plan. It was the cost. And logistics, ever fragile, made it worse. A key failure lay in coordination. While the Soviet rear had begun to evolve, the front lines had outpaced their own arteries. Ammunition dumps were left behind during advances. Replacement parts for artillery were stuck 3 oblasts away. Entire divisions found themselves isolated, not by enemy encirclement, but by empty roads. And the railways? They were close, but never close enough. Outside Lenino, engineers tried to lay a spur line under cover of fog. German bombers caught them mid-installation. Over 50 killed. The rest abandoned the site. It would take another 3 weeks to rebuild it. Meanwhile, the front waited. The result? Waves of Soviet attacks with undersupplied infantry, insufficient artillery, and zero momentum. And yet they kept coming. Why? Because they had to. Because Stalin needed to show progress. Because the Red Army believed, truly believed, that one more push could crack the salient open. But it never did. By the spring of 1943, over 1 million men had cycled through Rzhev. Soviet losses were staggering. German losses nearly as high. And yet the front barely moved. It devoured men and metal without a sound. The construction battalions, usually invisible in Soviet war stories, earned an unspoken reverence here. They fought not with rifles, but with shovels, with rail spikes, with frostbitten fingers. They laid the bones of the war effort, often in the mud that buried them. Once this worker, Sergei Klimov, aged 17, wrote in his last note, "I don't fight, I build, but every board I place feels like a shield for someone I will never meet." That was the soul of Rzhev. Not glory, not triumph. Endurance. And perhaps that's why Rzhev never became legend. No great victory, no cinematic conclusion, just a place that ate everything. But even that was a lesson, because logistics wasn't just about moving forward. Sometimes it was about surviving the standstill. Next, we move into the shadows, where rail lines aren't what they seem, and deception becomes a weapon.
Picture this. It's the dead of night on the Eastern Front. The moon is veiled behind low clouds, the ground slick with frost. Somewhere outside of Kursk, a German reconnaissance team intercepts a Soviet supply column. 10 trucks, lights off, crawling down a dirt track. The Luftwaffe is called in, the trucks are destroyed. Another blow to the Red Army, or so it seems. But those trucks, they were empty. The fuel, sand in barrels. And the real supply column, it passed 2 valleys south, under fog, guided by partisans through a forest the Germans thought impassable. This wasn't an accident. This was a strategy. By late 1942, the Soviet High Command had begun to master not just the movement of supplies, but the illusion of movement. Logistics wasn't just about transport anymore. It was about misdirection, disguise, psychological warfare waged not with bullets, but with bait. Sun Tzu wrote over 2 millennia ago, "All warfare is based on deception."
The Soviets read that line, and then they rewrote it for the railway. Throughout the front, entire networks of fake infrastructure were constructed. False depots made of painted canvas, rail lines laid in segments visible from the air, then abruptly ending in dead fields. Convoys built from wood frames, rolled downhill by teams of oxen just to create tire tracks. And most cunning of all, ghost trains. The NTPS, the Soviet People's Commissariat of Railways, deployed decoy trains with hollow shells and scrap metal meant to mimic the weight of real cargo. These trains ran at irregular intervals, producing smoke, light, and noise. They screamed across exposed zones like sacrificial lambs, and German artillery gladly obliged. Meanwhile, real trains traveled at night, under blackout, along routes rebuilt just hours before. Entire villages were tasked with camouflaging sidings. Civilians were ordered to replant trees, to scatter ashes from burnt tracks over the new ones, to erase the path behind them. This was logistics as sleight of hand. But it wasn't just about equipment. It was about perception. In the lead up to Operation Uranus, Soviet command orchestrated one of the most ambitious supply deceptions in modern warfare. German field intelligence had concluded that Soviets lacked the logistical depth to launch a large-scale offensive in the south. After all, their fuel depots appeared empty. Ammunition stores had vanished from aerial surveillance. Troop movement was minimal. What the Germans didn't realize was that the fuel had been moved at night in barrels disguised as hay carts through routes that didn't exist on any map. A captain in the 5th Tank Army later recalled, "We weren't told when we'd attack, only that when we reached the steppe, we'd be fed, fueled, and armed. That felt impossible until we arrived, and it was all there, hidden in barns, under chapel floors, even inside drained wells. This wasn't luck. It was deception executed with military precision." Decoy depots were established within artillery range of the Germans, designed to draw attention. Fake warehouses, start with empty crates and old shells, were shelled night after night, giving the impression that Soviet logistics were breaking under pressure. They weren't. They were waiting. Psychologically, the impact on the Germans was immense. Reports flooded headquarters of sudden Soviet supply collapses, of divisions going without fuel. Morale spiked. Commanders ordered attacks to capitalize on what they believed was Soviet exhaustion. But that exhaustion had been rehearsed. Fuel shortages were simulated. Trucks were parked conspicuously idle. Signal Corps sent false radio transmissions about supply crises. Even field soldiers were briefed to act weary inside of German patrols. One captured Soviet medic admitted under interrogation that his ambulance unit had been told to appear disorganized. Stretchers empty, tents flapping in the wind just to complete the illusion. And then the real offensive began. Not where the Germans were watching, but where they thought nothing could come. Logistics as misdirection allowed the Red Army to flip the battlefield without firing a shot. They didn't just move supplies, they moved the enemy's eyes. They fed the illusion of collapse to make victory look like resurrection. But this strategy wasn't without cost. Many of the deception teams never returned. Decoy drivers were captured. Supply officers sworn to secrecy disappeared without records, and yet their absence became presence. Each false route cleared the way for a real one. Each ghost column bought another hour for a division that would later break the German line. We often think of warfare as blood and steel, but here victory rode inside silence and shadow. Soviet logistics turned into a shell game where the enemy struck but never quite hit the real target. And this was just the beginning, because the deeper the war dragged into winter, the colder, darker, and more brutal the supply war would become. What happens when your engines freeze before you even reach the fight? Let's move to the next chapter.
The first thing to freeze wasn't a man. It was a gear. A rusted hinge on a supply truck near Demyansk, late November 1942. A temperature drop of 27 degrees overnight. By morning, every engine was dead. Fuel turned to slush, lubricants thick as tar, and that hinge, small, forgotten, cracked clean off when someone tried to force the door open. That broken hinge told a bigger truth. The Red Army wasn't just at war with the Wehrmacht, it was at war with the cold. This was not the poetic winter of postcards or snow-laced heroism. This was a brutal, flesh-tearing freeze that made even silence brittle. Soldiers called it the season of stillness. But it wasn't still. It was constantly breaking things, vehicles, supply lines, and morale. And yet, strangely, this deep winter became an advantage because the Soviets prepared for it. The Germans didn't. From the moment the snow began falling in late 1941, the Eastern Front turned into something more than terrain. It became a second battlefield, one ruled by nature's most indifferent weapon: cold. And the Soviets knew it intimately. Soviet engineers had designed their tanks with winter in mind. Wider tracks, simpler engines, air filters that could handle frozen dust. Soviet motor oil was formulated to stay viscous, even at minus 30 degrees C. Field manuals instructed drivers to light small fires under engines before turning them on. German tanks, they choked. Their engines seized, fuel lines cracked, radiators burst from internal ice. No matter how skilled a crew was, it couldn't outmaneuver frozen steel. Mechanics wept over machine guns that jammed every third shot. Lubricants we imported from Western Europe hardened like butter in the dark. One German officer near Veliki Luki reported that his entire motor pool, over 70 vehicles, became immobile in a single night. When asked what he needed, he replied with 2 words: spring and prayer. Meanwhile, the Soviets weren't just surviving the cold. They maneuvered through it because their supply system had adapted to it. Field uniforms were layered with sheepskin and padded cotton. Mittens were stitched from felt and rabbit fur. Bootliners were issued 2 per soldier, 1 for wear and 1 to dry. Even vodka was rationed not just as morale, but as medicinal heat. Behind the lines, logistical nodes shifted again. Routes were rerouted to follow frozen rivers, turning natural obstacles into hardened highways. Tracked sleds replaced trucks. Dog teams, relics of the 19th century, were reactivated in the north. In some sectors, supply sleds were pushed by hand through waist-high snow by quartermasters who hadn't seen the front in months. One of them was Yelena Sidorova, a young supply clerk assigned to the Kalen front. Her team operated on the edge of the Valdai Hills, pulling medicine and rations by sled, using trail markers etched in birch bark. She once wrote to her sister, "We don't hear gunfire here, just the snow cracking under our boots. That sound, that's survival." But even for the Soviets, the cold exacted a toll.
Frostbite was everywhere. Weapons froze. Batteries died. Horses collapsed mid-gallop, their lungs crystallizing from the inside. And when the temperature dropped below minus 40 degrees C, it didn't matter who you were, soldier or officer, hero or coward, you felt your blood hesitate. The weather didn't care for ideology. It simply punished the unprepared. Clausewitz spoke of friction in war, the idea that no plan survives the chaos of the field, but in Russia, friction had a form. It was the ice forming inside rifle bolts, the frost biting through gloves, and the silence that followed when an engine refused to turn. But here's what truly defined the Winter War. The Soviets had factored it in. They didn't fear the cold. They expected it. Their entire logistical structure bent to its weight. Warehouses were reinforced with snowbanks to insulate food. Ammunition was stored underground in dugouts carved into permafrost. Engineers carried torches, not for light, but for thawing steel. And their enemies? They froze. Quite literally. Entire German units reported casualty spikes from frostbite and exposure exceeding their battle losses. At Demyansk, then later at Ostashkov, medical tents filled faster with the frozen than with the wounded. And behind every failed attack was an immobile truck. Behind every retreat, an empty fuel line. The Germans had believed the Eastern Front could be mastered with precision. But precision shatters when it freezes. And so, through bitter weeks of stillness, the Red Army pushed, not with speed, but with persistence. Because every supply convoy that made it through the storm wasn't just the victory, it was defiance against nature, against collapse, against expectation. This was not just winter, it was war in the form of weather. And it set the stage for something far more precarious. What happens when your enemy isn't a fortress or a storm, but a river swollen and broken that cuts your front in two? Ahead lay the crossings of the Don.
Imagine standing at the edge of a vast frozen river where time doesn't flow, it stalls. No enemies in sight, no gunfire. Just black water moving slowly beneath a brittle layer of ice. Now imagine that this river decides whether your army lives or dies. That river is the Don. By late 1942, the Eastern Front was no longer a single front. It had shattered, fragmented into broken lines and logistical gaps that split entire armies. And the Don, winding through the southwest of Russia, wasn't just a natural boundary. It was a logistical nightmare with teeth. No bridges, no ferries left, only makeshift crossings built from planks, floating barrels, and faith. Every attempt to cross the Don was a gamble. Every convoy, a coin tossed into chaos. On paper, the Germans controlled the area. But in reality, the Wehrmacht was stretched thin, broken into columns that relied on supply lines that never arrived on time. And when the Soviets struck, their blow didn't come from a cannon. It came from the crossing. Because to the Red High Command, the Don wasn't a barrier. It was an opportunity. Unlike the German advance, heavy, predictable, mechanized, the Soviets had learned to move like the river itself, hidden, fluid, lethal. Each night, small units of engineers moved beneath the fog, driving stakes, building footbridges invisible from the air. At a crossing near Kalach, an entire battalion passed, without the Germans firing a single shot. How? Because the Soviets weren't crossing with tanks, they were crossing with logistics. Barrels of fuel, carts of hard bread, sacks of ammunition, camouflage tarps. First came the supplies, then came the men. General Rodion Milanovsky, commander of the Southwestern Front, once said, "A bridge may collapse under the weight of a tank, but not under the weight of intention." And that intention crossed the Don night after night, but not without blood. The night crossings were a dance with emotional collapse. Units marched at midnight in total silence. No one spoke. The sound of cracking ice could trigger enemy fire, and if the man fell into the water, no one stopped. Not out of cruelty, but because one wrong move could pull 10 others under. Corporal Anatoly Samarin, just 19, wrote in his soaked notebook, "I'd heard someone scream under the ice. I don't know if it was a comrade or my mind. I only know we kept walking, because the cold doesn't wait." Meanwhile, the Germans studied their maps, convinced no army could cross the Don in mass, especially not in winter, especially not in silence. They were wrong. In December 1942, a single Soviet truck home managed to establish a continuous supply flow from the eastern bank. That line fed 3 full divisions. 3 divisions that would soon close the western trap around Stalingrad. 1 truck, 1 route, 1 silent victory. The temporary structures, called pontoons, were kept under constant fire, and still they didn't stop. Each rebuilt plank was a life or death decision. Each meter crossed was a statement. Wars aren't won only by those who fire, but by those who sustain. The field engineers, soldiers without medals, slept by the river, their uniforms frozen to their bodies. They didn't speak of glory. They spoke of time. How long until the ice breaks? How long until the enemy hears us? Each answer marked the line between reinforcing the front or losing it. And this wasn't just engineering, it was strategy. The Germans relied on fixed routes, on visible rail junctions. The Soviets relied on the Don and their ability to make it navigable through sheer human will. In the end, it wasn't a tank that changed the course of battle. It was a floating plank, a sack of flour moving through the dark, a wooden bridge that wasn't meant to hold, but held. And in that crossing, as men stared toward the far bank, they understood the river wasn't the enemy. It was the frontier between collapse and resistance. Shall we move on to the next chapter? Because what comes next isn't a retreat. It's a strike. Precise, silent, lethal. The snow that fell on the steppe in November 1942 was thin, almost delicate. It blanketed the fields without warning, quiet, cold, concealing. To a German officer staring out from a bunker near Kalach, it seemed harmless, a cosmetic veil over territory already won. But beneath that snow, 2 rail lines were alive, and they were breathing ambush. Operation Uranus was not a rush of tanks. It wasn't a desperate charge from a battered army. It was a patient trap, built not in blood, but in silence.
planned by minds like Zhukov and Vasilevsky, but executed by thousands of hands who never saw the front. Hands that packed crates, laid tracks, rebuilt depots under frozen sky. It was an operation that began in logistics long before it echoed in artillery. Let's step back for a moment. The German Sixth Army, deep inside Stalingrad, was stretched thin, protected on the flanks not by elite divisions but by Romanian and Hungarian forces, units poorly equipped, barely motorized, and relying on overextended supply chains that snaked across half-frozen fields. Soviet intelligence had seen this weakness. But more importantly, so had their quartermasters. 2 key rail lines were redirected weeks before the operation began, one aimed at the northern flank near Serafimovich, the other at the southern steppe near Kotelnikovo. Neither line was bombed. Why? Because they hadn't existed until they were needed. Soviet engineers had camouflaged their work under darkness and snow, moving sleepers and rails at night, covering progress with bundled straw, painted canvas, and prayer. Each track brought one thing: movement. Not just men, but tons of fuel, rations, artillery shells. No massing of troops without the muscle to sustain it. And so while the Germans monitored movement inside the city, the Red Army's real blow was curling around the edges. A railway cut at the right place, a disguised fuel dump hidden in a sunken barn, a bridge rebuilt overnight with wood pulled from 2 villages, all of it fed the encirclement. There's a story, half legend, half recorded, of a Soviet logistics commander named Lev Arkhipov. He oversaw nighttime convoys on the southern flank. His teams disguised fuel drums as livestock carts, traveling through zones marked inactive on German maps. When asked how they passed unnoticed, he answered with one sentence: "The enemy doesn't chase shadows." And that was the brilliance of Uranus. It didn't arrive loudly. It didn't telegraph itself. It whispered. The artillery opened on November 19th. Within hours, Soviet columns erupted from the north and south, bypassing the strongest points and striking where the supply was weakest. But what surrounded the Germans wasn't just tanks. It was starvation. Paulus's men, confident in the supply line through Kalach, watched in disbelief as Soviet forces captured it within 48 hours. Ammunition dumps disappeared, fuel trucks never arrived, and still the Soviets moved because they had prepared to move. Inside the cauldron, the Germans were encircled not by walls, but by absence. No fuel, no bread, no winter coats. What the Soviets had created wasn't a noose, it was a vacuum. One German sergeant, Fritz Neumann, scribbled in his journal, "We are surrounded by ghosts. We hear nothing but the wind. Every fire we light becomes a beacon, every shout an echo with no answer. Our enemy is silent, but he grows louder every day." The Soviets, meanwhile, simulated weakness to bait the last German reserves forward. Convoys were intentionally delayed. Soldiers were ordered to feign exhaustion. Even trenches were left partially exposed to appear hastily dug. And when the Germans stepped forward to exploit what looked like collapse, they found only depth. Operation Uranus wasn't just a maneuver. It was a mirror. It showed the Wehrmacht not what they lacked tactically, but what they had never understood logistically. That rail wins battles before rifles do, that hunger kills faster than bullets, and that silence can be the deadliest sound of all. In the cold, in the snow, beneath smoke and illusion, the Soviet Union didn't just trap an army.
It redefined how modern war is won. Not always with thunder, sometimes with whispering steel. Now, with the battlefield encircled and the German front beginning to starve from the inside out, we ask, how did Soviet soldiers keep fighting through those bleakest days? What kept their hands steady even when frostbitten? In the next chapter, we explore a different kind of supply line, one made not of rail or fuel, but of hope.
In the long winter of 1942, amidst the biting winds that swept through the wreckage of the steppe, not every supply crate contained bullets. Some carried bottles, some carried letters, some carried the sounds of home, barely audible through battered radios. And those were the most powerful of all. You see, it's easy to count crates of ammunition or barrels of fuel. But how do you measure the weight of hope? The Red Army understood something their enemies didn't fully grasp until it was too late, that morale is not a luxury, it's a weapon. And like any good weapon, it had to be produced, transported, and deployed with precision, not behind desks, but in the trenches, in the hearts of men. There was vodka, issued not for celebration, but for survival, a ration per soldier, not just to dull the cold, but to fire the nerves. It burned down the throat and stoked something primal, a reminder that they were still alive, still standing, a liquid defiance against frostbite, fear, and fatigue. And then there were the radios, crude, static-laced, but sacred. On them came songs, speeches, messages from commanders, and clipped, sharp words from Stalin himself. But more importantly, news that the motherland was fighting, that the rear was working, that trains still moved, that steel was still forged, and that families still waited. In cities like Moscow, Gorky, and Kuyabyshev, voices were recorded in basements and coded and beamed across the ether like spiritual lifelines. One signal, one melody, one truth. You are not forgotten. And then there were the letters, folded into boots, tucked beneath coats, smuggled inside sacks of bread. Not every soldier received one, but those who did changed. In his diary, Nikolai Peskov wrote from the banks of the Don, "I did not feel the cold today. I received a letter. It smelled of soap, and it said, 'My boy is learning to write.' He calls every scribble, 'Papa. I will not die today.'" What was that worth? To Soviet command, it was invaluable. That's why entire battalions were assigned not to fight, but to carry morale. The 7th Political Directorate ran a logistical shadow operation, moving printed newspapers, curated rumor sheet, even drawings by children from liberated towns. These weren't sentimental gestures. They were calculated injections of spirit into collapsing morale structures. Because when a soldier believed someone still waited for him, he stood longer in the trench. He held the machine gun when others fled. He crossed the frozen river when his legs trembled from hunger. He didn't surrender, not because he couldn't, but because he couldn't bear the shame of not trying. Propaganda? Yes, but not lies. The stories they told were brutal, but true. That the Germans that burned entire villages in Ukraine, that they had slaughtered civilians in Minsk and Dnipropetrovsk, that they had no interest in peace, only subjugation. And in that harsh truth, the Red Army found justification, not just for fighting, but for enduring. Some spoke of a strange phenomenon near Stalingrad. Rumors spread among the Germans that Soviet reinforcements were arriving daily.
But in truth, it wasn't always fresh divisions. It was the same soldiers, moved between sectors, fed just enough to walk and ordered to shout loudly in the night. Boots stomped on wooden planks to simulate truck columns, radios playing recordings of engines idling. A psychological war, waged not with firepower, but with illusion. The Wehrmacht, already fraying from the fuel shortages and command breakdown, collapsed faster, not because of numbers, but because it lost belief. It stopped trusting that help would come. It stopped believing in its own maps. Meanwhile, Soviet troops, underfed, frostbitten, bleeding, kept moving. Not because they had more, but because they had something to move for. Hope. It moved faster than trains. Now, as the circle around Stalingrad tightens and winter deepens, we turn our attention to a darker price. Because not every crate made it, not every road was rebuilt, not every victory came without sacrifice. What happens when the cost of logistics is paid in blood?
There's a truth too uncomfortable for strategy books and too heavy for clean war memorials, that some roads weren't paved with stone or steel, but with bodies. The Soviet Union, in its relentless march from retreat to resistance and finally to counteroffensive, didn't just build its logistics system with rail and grit, it built it with blood. And the farther the front advanced, the more literal that truth became. What happens when steel runs out but men remain? When supply lines stretch thin and the only option is to carry war on your back? The Red Army answered that question with its hands. In the winter of 1943, during the desperate resupply of the Voronezh front, entire regiments became beasts of burden. Ammunition wasn't delivered by truck, it was hauled on foot. Soldiers turned into pack mules, one mortar shell at a time, across frozen terrain, barefoot in some cases because boots had worn out weeks earlier. Lieutenant Alexei Voronov recalled in a letter never mailed, discovered years later in a ruined farmhouse outside Livny, "The cold doesn't kill you in the chest. It kills you in the fingers first. I dropped one crate, my comrade didn't stop. He couldn't. We were told to deliver or die. We did both." There are no glory medals for this, but there was a war to be won. And the Soviet command was ruthless in its math. Logistics had to move. And if trucks couldn't be built fast enough, men would walk farther. If horses froze, convicts from the gulags would take their place. Yes, the gulags, that brutal shadow empire behind the Urals, became, in many ways, the bone marrow of Soviet logistics. Not just in factories, but in trenches, rail repairs, and road construction. Entire supply depots in Siberia and Kazakhstan were erected by prisoners who'd never see the front nor freedom. And still, it worked. Because the Red Army was never short of sacrifice. It was short of resources, short of precision tools, short of mechanized transport, but never short of people willing or forced to push the war forward. General Vasily Sokolovsky once told a group of Western observers, "We measure logistics differently, not in tons per kilometer, but in lives per offensive." It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a confession wrapped in cold pride. And with each advancing mile, the question grew darker. Can a war be just if its victory rests on so much suffering? That's
The paradox of the Eastern Front. Tactical brilliance coexisted with human cruelty. Logistic genius bloomed in fields fertilized by unmarked graves. A squadron near Rzhev in early 1942 was ordered to move ammunition across a ravine with no bridge. 32 men were sent with sleds. Only 14 returned. They completed the mission, and the battle raged on. What was the value of that mission? Strategically, it helped hold the flank. It delayed a German assault by 6 hours, enough time for reinforcements to arrive. But personally, emotionally, historically, those lives became a line on a map, a statistic in a report, and later, maybe, a name on a faded wall in a forgotten town. This wasn't negligence. This was calculation. Stalin's high command didn't weep for the dead. It planned around them. And in that cold calculus, the Red Army came something terrifying, unstoppable, not because of machinery, but because of its willingness to endure more than any other army on earth. But what did it lose in the process? A soldier who survives a bullet wound still bleeds. A nation that survives a war still mourns. And while victory came, the soul of the Soviet soldier was never quite the same. They returned not as heroes, but as carriers of scars too heavy to share. So yes, the Red Army built an unbreakable supply system, but at a cost, measured not in liters, not in rubles, but in lives. And now, as the smoke lifts from the snows of 1943 and the red tide begins to surge westward, a final question emerges. Did the world ever understand what really made the Soviet war machine move? Let us look to the West, to NATO, and the Cold War that followed, and see what lessons were completely missed.
In 1945, as the guns finally fell silent and Europe smoldered in the wake of 6 years of catastrophic war, the West turned its eyes eastward, not with awe, but with suspicion. The Red Army had carved its path from the ruins of Stalingrad to the gates of Berlin. But what precisely had enabled it to do so? The answer was misunderstood then, and tragically, it remains misunderstood now. Western analysts, British, American, French, rushed to decode Soviet tactics. They studied formations, dissected battles like Kursk and Silo Heights, obsessed over armor design and artillery ratios. What they missed, often entirely, was the quiet machinery beneath it all, the logistical web that had made it possible. They thought it was about brute force, about sheer numbers, about waves of infantry and endless tanks. But the Soviet edge wasn't just numbers, it was systems. Consider this, by 1944, the Red Army was deploying entire armored armies, numbering over 700,000 men, with precise timing and coordinated movement that rivaled any Western power. This wasn't chaos, this was choreography. Backed not by wealth, but by discipline and a willingness to bleed logistics into shape. Yet NATO, emerging onto a Cold War world of nuclear deterrence and rapid reaction strategies, failed to internalize this. Western doctrine leaned heavily on speed, technology, and air supremacy. It saw logistics as a support role, not as the war's spine. That's not how the Soviets saw it. To them, logistics wasn't backstage, it was frontline, invisible but decisive. And this misunderstanding created a blind spot, a dangerous one. During countless war games in the early decades after World War II,
NATO planners simulated massive Soviet thrusts into Western Europe. Calculations were made in tanks per mile, not trucks per day. Few asked, how did the Soviets sustain that tank? Where was the fuel, the food, the maintenance trail? They didn't ask because they never fully understood what the Stalin war machine had learned through blood and frost. Let's rewind to a letter sent by General Stamenko to Marshal Vasilevsky in 1943. It read bluntly, "If we control the bridgeheads and the depots, we own the front. Artillery is not the god of war. Supply is." This wasn't poetry. This was doctrine. But the West mistook it for rhetoric. As a result, when the Cold War heated, first in Korea, then in Vietnam, and later in Afghanistan, the lessons of the Eastern Front remained shelved. Western forces moved fast, but not always smart. They ran hot, but burned out quickly. The Soviets, by contrast, had built a doctrine that allowed for slow, brutal, sustainable advance. And when they stumbled, like in Afghanistan, it was often when they abandoned their own logistical discipline. Still, even today, we often glorify Soviet battlefield might without truly examining its backbone. Even now in military academies and think tanks, the logistics that lifted 500,000 men across the Don or resupplied entire divisions through forests without roads are summarized with terms like rear echelon coordination or support efforts, sterile phrases that hide the brutal genius at play. The Soviet Union weaponized distance, weaponized hardship, turned the harshest winters into tactical advantages, not by sheer will, but by mastering the boring, grinding, soul-draining craft of logistics. So when the West feared the Iron Curtain, it should have feared the supply chain hiding behind it, not the tank rolling down a highway, but the railhead 400 kilometers behind it, humming in the dark, unseen and uncelebrated. And here's the better irony. Those who survived the war, engineers, train operators, food clerks, depot commanders, weren't remembered as heroes. But without them, no hero would have reached Berlin. In the end, the Red Army's real secret weapon wasn't a secret at all. It was simply misunderstood. Logistics wasn't just the means, it was the message. And even now, in the age of satellites and drones, we would do well to remember that wars aren't won where bullets fly. They're won where crates are stacked, where bridges are built, where roads stay open, no matter the cost. Because if the Soviet story taught us anything, it's that those who ignore the lifelines of war are doomed to fight on empty.
The battlefield is where stories are told, but it is not always where wars are won. When we imagine war, we often see the chaos, the gunfire, the tanks, the flags raised in victory. But if you dig deeper, peel away the smoke and the noise, you find something else, something quieter, something colder, something less visible, yet far more constant. Behind every advance, behind every decisive charge, there is a chain of fuel, of food, of sweat, of steel. A web spun not by generals shouting in war rooms, but by men and women with grease on their hands, with frostbitten cheeks, with aching backs. Not on the front line, but behind it. The Soviet Union didn't win the Eastern Front with sheer bravery alone. It won with relentless movement,
with unbreakable logistics, with bridges rebuilt overnight by men who'd had no sleep in 3 days, with trains that ran through firebombed stations, with supply convoys trudging through ice so thick it swallowed wheels whole. It was a war of numbers, yes, but also of muscle, of endurance, of silent heroism. Because what is strategy without supply? What is courage without ammunition? Behind every Soviet soldier that stormed Berlin, there were thousands who never fired a shot. Drivers who never made it back. Rail engineers who laid track into hell. Nurses who boiled water in dented helmets. And children, yes, children, who forged bullets in shadowy factories while dreaming of brothers who had vanished in the East. These stories don't always make the textbooks, but they shape the outcome just the same. Think of Trofim Ivanov, a mechanic from Tula. He never saw combat. His war was fought with wrenches, not rifles. But in the winter of 1942, under a canvas tarp in sub-zero temperatures, he rebuilt over 60 engines in a span of 2 weeks. Engines that pulled artillery, food, and wounded men out of Stalingrad. Trofim never knew their names, but they knew his work. They lived because of it. This is what war really looks like. When the cameras are off, when the cheers have faded, when all that remains is grit, determination, and logistics. War is won behind the lines, in whispers, not shouts. It's won in the calculations scribbled in mud-stained notebooks, in the quiet planning of quartermasters, in the cracked fingers of those who loaded crates for the 1,000th time, in the sheer brutal refusal to stop moving. Because if the front line is aflame, then logistics is the oxygen that keeps it alive. And without that breath, steady, invisible, relentless, there is no fire, no victory, only silence. So when we remember the Eastern Front, let us honor the bravery of those who fought. But let us also pause for the unseen, the unarmed, the ones who marched with nothing but purpose, the ones who built the road to victory, mile after 18 mile. In the end, war is not won in one moment. It is won in millions. And most of them happen far from the battlefield.